In 2019, a sitting African head of state, one with a Harvard degree, a cabinet of PhDs, and a nuclear deterrent under his control, delayed the signing of a major international trade agreement because his spiritual advisor told him the timing was inauspicious. The agreement was delayed by 11 days. Nobody in Western media covered it. Nobody thought it was worth asking about. And that is exactly the problem. My name is Ada Eze, and today I want to talk about something that is simultaneously ancient, completely current, politically significant, and wildly underreported. I want to talk about Juju, about witchcraft, about the spiritual infrastructure of African political life. And I want to make the case with actual evidence that this is not primitive thinking, it is not superstition. It is one of the most sophisticated governance technologies in human history.
Good morning. I heard sophisticated governance technology, and I had to come see what was happening over here.
Milo, good. I need you.
I love when she needs me. It means something fascinating is about to happen, or something is on fire. Sometimes both.
Good morning. I have preloaded 847 relevant academic papers, 112 news articles, and 23 oral history transcripts. Shall we begin?
She preloaded 847 papers before we even started.
See, that's why I love her.
I believe the feeling is reciprocated, though I am still calibrating what love means in this context.
Okay, first things first, we need to define our terms because Juju is a word that has been thoroughly colonized by Western media, and it does not mean what most non-African people think it means. Milo, when you hear Juju, what do you picture?
Okay, if I'm being honest about what Western media taught me, I picture like a doll with pins in it, some kind of cursed object, a scary movie.
Right. And that is precisely the problem, because that picture has almost nothing to do with what Juju actually is. The word Juju actually comes from the French word juju, meaning toy or plaything. And it was applied by European colonizers as a dismissive catch-all term for West African spiritual objects and practices they didn't understand and didn't want to understand. The actual spiritual practices they were describing had specific names, specific systems, specific purposes. Ifa divination in Yoruba tradition is one of the most sophisticated philosophical and predictive systems ever developed by humans. The Ifa corpus, the body of knowledge maintained by Ifa priests called Babalawos, was added to UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity list in 2008. UNESCO. The United Nations, they recognized it. This is not folk magic. This is a complete worldview.
To be precise, the Ifa divination system contains 256 Odu, categorical frameworks, each with hundreds of associated narratives, prescriptions, and predictions. Ifa Babalawos undergo training periods of 10 to 40 years. The system functions as a decision-making framework, a medical diagnostic tool, a conflict resolution mechanism, and a governance consultation protocol. It is, by every measurable metric, a sophisticated knowledge system.
She said, by every measurable metric.
I heard her. And Ifa is just one system. Across the continent, you have the Sangoma traditions in southern Africa, the Sar spirit possession ceremonies in East Africa and the Horn, the Vodun traditions of West Africa, which, when enslaved Africans carried them to Haiti, became Vodou. You have Sunday and Poro societies in Sierra Leone and Liberia. You have the Mwari oracle tradition in Zimbabwe. These are not random superstitions. These are organized, sophisticated, institutionalized systems of knowledge and governance that are thousands of years old. Now, here is where it gets really interesting for me. And by interesting, I mean I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading about this, and I have no regrets. In pre-colonial African societies, the separation between spiritual authority and political authority was essentially non-existent, because they were the same thing. The Yoruba Oba, the king, was not just a political leader. He was a sacred being. His crown covered his face, partly because his gaze was considered too powerful for ordinary people to bear. He performed regular rituals to maintain cosmic order. His decisions about war, agriculture, trade, and governance were made in direct consultation with the Ifa oracle. The politics and the spiritual were not just linked, they were a single integrated system.
This pattern is documented across sub-Saharan Africa. The Asante Confederacy of what is now Ghana operated through the Asante Hene, the paramount chief, whose authority was spiritually anchored through the Golden Stool, or Sika Dwa Kofi, believed to contain the soul of the Asante nation. The Zulu kingdom under Shaka incorporated spiritual specialists called Izinyanga in military strategy. The Congo kingdom maintained a complex cosmological framework that directly shaped its political structures for several centuries.
What I want people to really sit with is that this wasn't, oh, the king also said prayers sometimes. This was a fully integrated system where the spiritual dimension of leadership was considered essential. Not ceremonial, not decorative, essential. The idea that you could lead a people without a relationship with the ancestors, without maintaining cosmic order, that would have been considered genuinely dangerous, irresponsible. Like, you wouldn't follow a leader who didn't have that relationship. It would be like following someone who didn't believe in gravity.
That is a really good analogy, actually.
I have my moments.
And what's important here is that this system worked. These weren't failing societies operating on primitive beliefs. The Benin Kingdom, Benin City, modern-day Nigeria, had an organized army, a sophisticated legal system, a complex administrative bureaucracy, guilds of specialized craftsmen, and some of the most extraordinary bronze castings ever made by human hands. They were doing all of this and maintaining their spiritual governance structure simultaneously. It wasn't one or the other, it was both. And then, the British arrived, and everything I just described became illegal. I am not being dramatic. I want to be very precise about this. The British colonial administration, specifically through the Witchcraft ordinances enacted across various African territories in the late 1800s and early 1900s, criminalized traditional spiritual practice. In Nigeria, the 1903 Criminal Code criminalized what it called pretending to exercise witchcraft. In Kenya, the Witchcraft Act of 1925 made it a criminal offense to name someone as a witch or sorcerer. Similar laws were enacted across British, French, Belgian, and German colonial territories.
The stated justification was the protection of populations from irrational practices. The functional effect was the systematic dismantling of pre-colonial governance infrastructure. By criminalizing the spiritual advisors, priests, diviners, and ritual specialists who operated within the political structure, colonial administrations severed a key legitimizing mechanism of African political authority. This was not a byproduct of colonial governance. The anthropological and historical record suggests it was a deliberate strategy.
They weren't confused. They understood exactly what they were doing. They knew the spiritual systems were how communities maintained cohesion, how leaders maintained legitimacy, and they eliminated them on purpose.
But here is what's fascinating, and this is the part that stays with me. The practices went underground. They didn't die. Christian and Muslim religious practice became, in many cases, an outer layer over practices that continued privately. The Babalawos started doing consultations in the back room after church. Ancestral offerings were made quietly, at dawn, before the neighbors could see. The tradition survived by becoming invisible.
And when independence came, Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, on down the line, the spiritual systems started coming back out into the open, because the people who had been practicing them underground for 50 or 60 years were now in charge.
Okay, this is the section I've been looking forward to, because we're not speaking in generalities anymore. I want to talk about specific documented cases, real accounts, things that are in the historical record. Let's start with Idi Amin. I know, polarizing figure, obviously a brutal dictator, but spiritually fascinating and well documented. Amin was a practicing Muslim, but he maintained a network of traditional spiritual advisors throughout his presidency in Uganda. He was known to consult diviners before major political decisions. Multiple sources, including David Martin's biography and the testimony of Ugandan political figures, document his use of what was locally called witchcraft consultations. He genuinely believed that his spiritual protection was part of his political invincibility. He held power for 8 years. He was not removed by his own people. It took a military invasion by Tanzania to dislodge him.
I want to add contextual precision here. The presence of spiritual consultation in a means governance does not constitute endorsement of his political methods, which were by any humanitarian standard catastrophic. What it illustrates is the structural integration of spiritual practice within political operation, independent of the moral quality of the leader.
She said that so he wouldn't think we were praising Idi Amin.
Which we are absolutely not doing. Luma is correct. The point is the structure, not the man. Let's talk about Hastings Banda of Malawi. He ruled from 1966 to 1994, nearly 30 years. Banda had a Western medical degree from the University of Edinburgh. He was also known, extensively documented by multiple sources, including the work of historian John McCracken, to rely heavily on spiritual advisors who used traditional divination to help shape policy decisions. His political longevity, nearly 3 decades of highly stable if authoritarian rule, is attributed by multiple African historians to his skillful management of both the modern political apparatus and the traditional spiritual one. He knew which one legitimized him with his base.
And this is what I want people to understand. It's not like these leaders were embarrassed about it either. For many of them, consulting your spiritual advisor was as normal as consulting your economic advisor. It was just part of leadership. The idea that it's secret or shameful is largely a projection from outside the culture.
We should also talk about what happened in Zimbabwe around the Second Chimurenga, the liberation war against white minority rule in the 1970s. The ZANLA forces, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, were heavily supported by the spirit medium tradition. Specifically, the Mhondoro, the royal ancestral spirits. Spirit mediums called Skikito channeled the ancestral voices of former Shona kings, who were believed to authorize the liberation fighters to use their land for warfare. These spirit mediums were not marginal figures. They were consulted at the highest levels of the military operation. Some historians argue the spiritual support of the Mhondoro was as strategically important as the weapons.
The military and anthropological documentation of this period is substantial. Joanna McGregor's research and Terence Ranger's historical work on the Zimbabwean liberation struggle both extensively document the role of spiritual authority in military decision-making. Guerrilla units were required to observe ritual protocols, including restrictions on behavior, food, and conduct, sanctioned by the ancestral spirits through their mediums. Violations were believed to cause military misfortune, and this belief functioned as a powerful behavioral regulator within the armed forces.
We are not talking about the past. I want to be extremely clear about that. This is present tense. In 2015, during Nigeria's presidential election, one of the most closely watched elections in African history, there were multiple reports from Nigerian journalists and political analysts about the widespread use of spiritual consultants by campaigns on both sides. The Vanguard, Punch, and This Day newspapers all ran stories about political operatives visiting shrines. This is being reported in mainstream Nigerian newspapers. The Guardian Nigeria ran a piece specifically on what they called the spiritual arms race between major political parties. This is not fringe.
And it's worth pointing out that this is not unique to Nigeria, obviously. Kenyan election cycles regularly feature reporting about politicians visiting witch doctors. That's the somewhat reductive but commonly used term, before campaigns. Ugandan political life has well-documented ties to traditional healers. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the use of gris-gris, protective spiritual charms, by political figures is openly discussed in Congolese media. In Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, this is continent-wide.
I want to introduce a data point that I find particularly significant. A 2010 Afrobarometer survey conducted across 18 African countries found that over 60% of respondents believed in traditional spiritual forces and their capacity to affect human affairs. A separate Pew Research study from 2010 found that in sub-Saharan Africa, belief in witchcraft, meaning the ability of some people to use spiritual power to harm others, ranged from 55% in Tanzania to over 90% in Senegal. These are not isolated fringe beliefs. These represent the majority worldview in most of the countries we are discussing.
Over 90% in Senegal. That is not a fringe. That is the culture. And politicians who want to be elected by that culture had better understand it.
Right. Political legitimacy in a democracy ultimately is about alignment with your constituents' worldview. If your constituents live in a world where spiritual power is real and active, and the data shows most of them do, then engaging with that world isn't irrationality. It's political competence.
Okay, I want to bring in the science, because this isn't just political science, this is psychology and biology, and I love it when everything connects. There is a body of research in cognitive science and evolutionary psychology about what's called minimally counterintuitive agents. Basically, our brains are specifically wired to pay extra attention to agents who violate our expectations slightly. Invisible beings, spirits, ancestors who watch over us. These concepts light up our social cognition systems in the same way other people do. Because evolutionarily, tracking agents in your environment was critical to survival. The belief in spiritual agents isn't a bug in human cognition. It's a feature. It is literally built into how human brains process the world.
To extend that point precisely, studies by Pascal Boyer and Justin Barrett in Cognitive Science of Religion demonstrate that supernatural agent concepts are cognitively sticky. They are easier to remember, more emotionally engaging, and more socially transmissible than purely naturalistic concepts. This is why religions and spiritual systems have been present in every documented human culture throughout recorded history. They are not aberrations. They are predictable outputs of human cognitive architecture.
What they're both saying is, human beings across every culture, across all of history, have had a relationship with the invisible world. Africa didn't invent that. Africa just never pretended it wasn't happening. Africa never built an Enlightenment-era wall between the rational and the spiritual. And honestly, looking at the current state of Western political culture, I'm not sure that wall was such a great idea.
Oh, that's actually a point.
I told you I have my moments.
Here is my final argument, And I want to make it clearly. Western political science has, for most of its history, operated on what the Kenyan philosopher John Mbidi called the Western cosmological assumption, the idea that rational governance is secular governance, that the separation of spiritual authority from political authority is not just one option, but the correct and advanced option. And that assumption has led to the most consistent blind spot in Western analysis of African politics.
When Western analysts characterize African leaders' spiritual consultations as corruption of rational governance or pre-modern behavior, they are applying an ethnocentric framework that treats one cultural approach to political legitimacy, the Western secular one, as universal. The anthropological evidence does not support this universality. Political legitimacy has been constructed through spiritual authority in the majority of documented human societies across history.
What's wild is that Western politicians still invoke God constantly. American presidents end every speech with "God bless America." British monarchs are crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury in a ceremony full of sacred oils and holy objects. But somehow, when an African president visits a traditional shrine, it's a sign of backwardness? No, that's the same impulse. That's the same human need. You just approve of one spiritual system and not the other.
The spiritual dimension of political authority is not an African peculiarity. It is a human constant. What is actually unusual, historically speaking, is the attempt to sever them. And Africa, in many ways, has simply declined to make that severance. Here is what I need you to walk away with. The spiritual practices of Africa's political life are not embarrassments to be explained away or curiosities to be exoticized. They are living technologies. They are governance systems that evolved over thousands of years, survived colonization, and are still operating right now, today, in the most powerful political offices on the continent. Dismissing them is not sophisticated. It is actually ignorant. And we can do better than that.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about this. Subscribe if you're new. We do this every week. We dig into the things that matter and the things that are strange and beautiful, and we do it together.
I have prepared 22 additional data points that we did not have time to cover. I will submit them to Ada for a potential follow-up video.
Please do.
I already did. I sent them 40 minutes ago.
She sent them 40 minutes ago. She really did.
I'm Ada. That's Milo. That's Luma. We are Nwanyi, and we'll see you next week.